Good evening.
Hello, how are you?
Oh, I'm fine. Do we have
Good.
people in the waiting room?
We have some people. I'm going to make
Well,
you
that's good. I didn't want
co-host.
everybody to be scared off by the homework.
I don't think that was so scary.
Well, I don't know, but
Well, the funny thing of this group, they get on and then they get out of the waiting room and they come back and they go out and they come back. Like, we haven't done this before. Like, Sam Godsteiner gets on and off like 10 times. Like, I don't understand why she does that. But all right, now there's 2 people. There were 5 people. So they're like dropping on whatever they're doing here. But I'll let them in and we'll wait for a couple minutes.
okay.
Because they're coming back. Here comes
Mhm.
Sam and Suzanne. There we go.
Mhm. Yeah, okay. Good evening, everybody. You have to connect and then unmute. I know.
Yeah, I have you today.
Yeah. Well, at least I'm not muted today. I'm hardly ever muted. People, some people like that, some people don't, it's the way it is. All right. So Jennifer sent you all a question, and so we're going to start with that tonight. Who are some of the great Jews that you have heard of from the 2nd century up to the 17th century? Anybody want to start on that?
Well, Rabbi Akiba and Maimonides. I
Okay.
don't know if he fits in the right category. And
Yes. Rabbi Akiba, who we
he definitely
is in the
fits.
2nd century, and Maimonides we'll talk about a little later.
Yeah. And I think Spinoza was later than the 1600s. He was the 1800s, wasn't he?
No, he was 1600s. But as someone who, only came from Jewish birth, but never philosophically connected with the Jewish community, he may be one of the great philosophers, but I wouldn't put him down as one of the great Jews. Right?
What about Hillel?
Hillel is 1st century, actually was born 1st century
Hillel
before
too.
the Common Era.
Yeah, Hillel too.
Well, yeah, Hillel the Younger.
The one who fixed the calendar.
Yes. Okay. So, and I see in the chat, Jennifer mentions Hillel and Maimonides. Okay. So you're in good company there, Jennifer. Right? Anybody else? Yeah, Suzanne.
To unmute myself. Could we also consider, although we don't necessarily know the names of the rabbis that basically put the rabbinical form that we use now together, and in a sense helped found the Judaism that we know?
Yes. And, there's probably a couple of hundred rabbis mentioned in the Talmud. So that would be a big list. They
all contributed.
They all contributed. And, there were really 2 different schools of thought among those rabbis. And one of them, which ultimately became more popular, was the school of Rabbi Akiba.
Mhm.
Right? So I'll talk just a little bit about that tonight. Right? Anybody else? Evening, Nick. Nick is connecting to audio.
Did you ask for notable Jews or notable rabbis?
Notable Jews.
What about the man who sort of created
About
the
who?
press? David Bomberg.
Okay.
He was credited with printing Jewish books the first time on
Uh-huh.
mechanical press.
Yes. So, printing certainly made an enormous difference in Jewish life, never mind everybody else's.
Now, I think I have the wrong century again, but he was very famous, but not necessarily for good things. Was that Baal Shem Tov? Was that the 1800s?
Baal
or-
Shem Tov was one of the great rabbis, and he lived in the 18th century.
Okay, I thought
Yeah.
so.
So,
Oh, it was
you're
the
sort of,
1700s. Yeah, that's
yeah,
pretty far back.
so bordering on modernity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I read that book about Rabbi Akiba and his friends and how they had all these problems. You mentioned it one day.
You're talking about As a Driven Lead.
Yes, I did
Yes.
read that book. It was very interesting. I
Uh-huh.
highly recommend it to other
Yeah.
people.
It is a great story, and very much based on what the Talmud tells about
Akiva and his friends. There were
Elisha ben
four of them,
Abuya.
right?
I was thinking also about the Kabbalists and as a group, kind of.
Mhm. The Kabbalists as a group are certainly very interesting. It used to be believed that Moshe DeLeon was the author of the Zohar, right? More recent scholarship has questioned that, although not the fact that he had a role in its development. So, yeah, if you were going to include someone like, for instance, Isaac Luria, that would be great. I'm going to talk about the Kabbalists a little bit further down the line, probably in 2 weeks.
Okay.
So, patience. Yes, Suzanne.
I think you answered this question, but what made you cut off at the 17th century? Is it because there were so many changes in the next century?
Yeah, as you head towards modernity, it's a whole different community and a whole different set of challenges. And also, with the exception of a few people, there really weren't so many individuals in the 18th century who made a mark. I mean, I can think of two in particular. Certainly the Baal Shem Tov was one, and the other was the Vilna Gaon. Right? If you were a Chabadnik, you would say, well, of course, the first Chabad rabbi, Shneir Zalman of Liadi, right? But other Hasidim might argue about that. Okay. So before I start in on my list, I want to tell you that we're going to have 2 more classes after this, and that will conclude the Jewish literacy class.
Oh, I thought you were going further.
I know, I thought so too. There are 2 things that happened. One is that I was really hoping that I could cover a lot more in a year than I now see that I'm going to be able to do. I can't cover everything in 1 year, and I can see that it's going to be a futile effort to try. The other problem is that I'm faced with some other competing demands right now, and something has to give. So we're going to have 2 more sessions after tonight. The 2 last sessions One of them, I'm going to deal with the impact of codes in Jewish law. Right? So there are some great people involved in the making of codes, but only one of them is on the list for tonight. And then the last session is going to be more about Jewish mysticism, which I can't really possibly cover in one session anyway, but I can at least give you kind of an introduction to that and why it became popular, when it became popular, and with a couple of the people who really made it popular. So for tonight's list, right? Just as you may not have noticed this, but almost everybody who was mentioned was a Jewish scholar, a scholar of Torah.
Right.
Right? Those are the people who got remembered from earlier times. So the first, and I'm going to go chronologically on this list. The first one for me is Rabbi Akiba, right? Because first of all, he was born and lived the first 40 years of his life without any Jewish background whatsoever. I mean, just because he happened to live in Palestine didn't mean that he knew the kinds of things that rabbis knew, or that he had any notion of what the rabbis wanted Jewish life to be like. He was a shepherd, right, until he was 40 years old. Now, even though King David and even Moses were shepherds, being a shepherd is not a highly desirable job. I mean, if you stand around in sheep dung all day, you'll understand, right? So in a way, Rabbi Akiba was kind of like what we used to think of as an Aggie, right? And he didn't start learning Torah until he was 40 years old. Now, what made that happen? Well, he got to know his employer's daughter, whose name was Rachel. And Rachel became very fond of him. And she said that she would marry him on one condition. And that was that he had to start learning Torah.
Oh, yeah, right.
No. Now, so imagine yourself at 40 years old taking on a new occupation. I know for some of us that happens all the time. You know, it happens in every family these days. But back then, you know, you didn't necessarily live to be that old. So to take on a new occupation at 40, you know, it was, and maybe it's like going to university for the first time, starting a program that would take you many years to master. And Rachel's father was so enraged about this that he disowned her, which meant that instead of being able to support him from, you know, what her father had or would have ordinarily given her, she had to go out and make a living. And they persevered. They persevered, and eventually he did become one of the leading sages, not only extremely learned, but really the leader of a whole school of Jewish thought. One school of thought was led by Rabbi Yishmael, right? There are not too many Jews these days who name their children Ishmael, right? You know, after, you know, the older brother of Isaac, the son of Abraham, who turned out not to have anything to do with Jewish life afterwards. Well, this guy, maybe that's why there aren't that many people who name their child Ishmael. But this guy was a learned rabbi, and his method of biblical interpretation was simply to take the most narrow understanding of what the text meant. I don't mean that in a narrow-minded sense, but just, you know, without any unnecessary expansion of the meaning of the text. Right? Rabbi Akiba took on a much more expansive reading of the Torah, through which, for instance, any letter or word that seemed to be unnecessary would be an excuse to base some new action, some new interpretation on that extra letter or extra word. And by taking a more expansive reading of the Torah, he was able to add a great deal to the oral Torah. Unfortunately, Rabbi Akiba supported the last big rebellion against the Romans, the one that began in 130 of the Common Era. He supported the general of the Jewish army there, who was known as Bar Kokhba, which literally means son of a star. But Akiba even believed, at least for a time, that Bar Kokhba might be the Messiah. Right? Well, that rebellion, like all the other wars against the Romans, really didn't go very well. And for a time, the Romans were so enraged at this rebellion and the fact that some of the rabbis supported it, that they would no longer permit the study and the teaching of Torah. Rabbi Akiba was not deterred by that, and he continued to teach and to teach publicly. Right? When he was asked why he would do that when he knew that the Romans would crack down on him personally, he told a parable of a fox and a fish. And in this parable, the fox is sitting by the riverside, and he sees a fish swimming down the river. And the fox says to the fish, there's someone with a trap downstream waiting to catch you. Why don't you come out here with me and come on my back and you'll be safe? Right? The fish says to the fox, "What kind of idiot do you think I am? I may just be a fish, but I know that I can't survive out of water. And if I can't, if I need water to survive, I can't I can't go out there and hope to avoid the fate that I would face if I'm caught in the trap." And Rabbi Akiba said, the Torah for us is like water for the fish. If you think we're in trouble when I'm teaching Torah, think how much more trouble we'll be in if no one teaches Torah. And the Romans did catch him, and they tortured him to death. And he was martyred by the Romans, publicly reciting the Shema with his last breath. And that ends the story of Akiba. But one of the great rabbinic leaders of the early years of the Common Era, and certainly the model of someone who took on learning Torah very late in life, relatively late in life, and committed himself to it wholeheartedly. Let me stop here. Ask if anybody has any questions relating to Rabbi Akiba. Okay, hearing none. Let's get to number two. Number two is someone that many of you may not have heard of at all. He is known as Sadhya Gaon. His actual name was Sadhya, but he held the rank of Gaon in Babylonia. as Babylonia became the center of Jewish life, most of the rabbis lived and taught there, and most of the great centers of Jewish learning were located there. And as of the 8th century, the heads of those centers, those places of learning, the heads were known as Gaonim. Today, Gaon means genius. But in Babylonia, it was just a term of special respect for the heads of the yeshivas. And if you lived somewhere else, like, for instance, the budding Jewish community in far-off Spain, or if you wanted an answer to a question of Jewish law and maybe you were in Rome, right? So you would send your question to the Gaon of your generation. A couple years later, maybe the answer would come back if you were fortunate, okay? The Gaon also would hire the lay leader of the Babylonian Jewish community, the political leader of the Jewish community. So that was interesting. That would be like Rabbi Strauss hiring the president of the congregation. Okay. One advantage of that is it's easier to get good leaders. I mean, who could say no if Rabbi Strauss asked you to be in charge, right? So, yeah. Over the 5 centuries in which there were Gaonim, the most important of them lived in the 10th century, and that was Sadhya. As Telushkin points out, Sadhya was the only one of the Gaonim who had not been born in Babylonia. He was born in Egypt. And so he really had to be head and shoulders above other candidates to be asked to become the Gaon of his generation. Telushkin spends some time on a large controversy between Sadhya and the lay leader at the time, because Sadhya refused to support a legal and financial ruling which the lay leader had issued, all of which just shows that Sadhya didn't back down from a fight. Right? Nevertheless, what was most impressive about Sadhya was his vast learning and writings. He wrote the first systematic philosophical explanation of Judaism. It was a book called Emunot V'Deot, Beliefs and Opinions, a book that is still read and studied today. Many other important writings. He translated the Tanakh into Arabic, which had never been done before. He prepared a uniform prayer book for Jews living in Arab and Islamic lands. He wrote a number of essays refuting the beliefs of the Karaites. The Karaites were a Jewish sect who rejected the validity of the oral Torah. They're actually still around. There are a few Karaites to this day, and they still argue with Sadhya. They still read and dispute with the arguments that Sadhya made. Scholarship around Sadhya's work still continues today. It's not everyone who lived over 1,000 years ago who is still studied. Right? So Sadhya in the 9th and 10th centuries, the most famous of the Gaonim, and probably the the leading light among the rabbis over a period of, I would say, 6 or 7 centuries. There were many learned rabbis, especially involved with the editing of the Talmud in the 6th and 7th century, but no one quite of the stature of Sadhya. Any comments or questions here? Okay, next up, another person who is not well known today. He lived in Germany in the 10th century, and his name was Rabbeinu Gershom. he was referred to by European Jews at the time as Ma'or HaGolah, the light of the exile. I guess that's the kind of title they could give rabbis back then. You know, no rabbi in the United States or even Britain today gets called the light of the exile. It just, they don't respect rabbis the way they used to. But Rabbeinu Gershom was regarded as the singular rabbinic authority for all of Europe. Now, most Jews in that time in Europe, and there were not that many, they lived in either France or Germany, maybe a few in Italy. There had been a Jewish community in Rome, but once it became the Holy Roman Empire and under Christianity, wasn't so favorable for Jews. Situation in Europe in those times wasn't generally favorable for Jews. Living among medieval Christians had a lot of difficulties associated with it. The one thing that Rabbeinu Gershom had going for him is that he was actually recognized as the singular authority for European Jewry. And so, he could make decrees and people would actually follow them. A rabbi gets up today and says something, and first of all, even his own congregants don't necessarily listen to him. And secondly, everybody outside the congregation says, who are you? Who made you in charge for us? Right? But Rabbeinu Gershom was sort of in charge, and he could do some great things because he was recognized as being in charge. So what were the decrees that he made for European Jewry? The most famous of them was a ban on polygamy. The Torah and even the oral Torah up to that time never said that a man couldn't have more than one wife. Now, you see many examples of that in the Torah, and of course, the same was true for Islam. In Islam, it was a status symbol to have more than one wife. It was kind of like serial monogamy today. But the Torah isn't necessarily recommending polygamy because all of the polygamous relationships are filled with problems. Just, think about Sarah and Hagar, Leah and Rachel. King David has a bunch of wives, and look what happens to his sons. King Solomon had 1,000 wives, according to scripture. And, they multiplied idolatrous shrines in the kingdom. So none of the polygamous relationships really went well. But the bad thing for Rabbeinu Gershom and for European Jewry was that they were among the Christians for whom, polygamy was a moral issue. Right? Now, it didn't happen that often in European Jewry. I mean, who could afford more than one wife? Right? And, who needs the aggravation and the jealousy and whatever? But among the Christians, it looked bad for the Jews. And so Rabbeinu Gershom said, for Ashkenazim, for European Jewry, I am banning polygamy for the next 1,000 years. Why didn't he say forever? Well, it was easier to justify such a decree if it wasn't permanent. It didn't seem like he was adding to the Torah. It was a temporary measure, right? Those who lived among the Muslims, of course, they didn't even know about this decree. It didn't apply to them, and they ignored it. Polygamy was only dropped by Sephardi Jewry and those from Arab and Muslim lands until after the state of Israel came into being. the numbers dropped over time, but there were still a few among those who left Arab countries after 1948 and went to Israel, and they were allowed to keep the wives they had. But in 1953, they made it official that you couldn't do that anymore. Okay? So that was the first and most famous decree of Rabbeinu Gershom. Second thing, and also very, very important, he ruled that a woman cannot be divorced without her consent. Now, in the Torah, in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, if a man wanted to divorce his wife, he didn't even have to give a reason. He did have to pay her the sum that was stipulated in the ketubah, in the marriage document. But, for some men, that was not a hindrance to treating a wife so casually. So since the time of Rabbeinu Gershom, divorce had to be accepted by both parties. Now with civil divorce, this is less important, because if you get a civil divorce, you're going to be apart anyway, right? But in earlier times, this protected women from being treated so cavalierly. A third decree from Rabbeinu Gershom, which in its time was extremely important, and that is, you're not allowed to read someone else's mail. Right? Now, that sounds like, whoop-de-doo now. I mean, everybody knows you can't read, you're not supposed to read somebody else's mail, right? I know parents sometimes do it anyway, but you're not supposed to, right? And Telushkin notes that even in modern times, a private letter from someone might have a note on the outside saying Takanat Rabbeinu Gershom, meaning the decree of Rabbeinu Gershom prohibits you from opening this envelope unless you're the person to whom it's addressed. Right?
I don't think envelopes came about until much later.
Some kind of pouch, probably. Right?
Sometimes you see on these, historical fiction things on TV, even in England in the 1700s, they just give notes and they put a seal on it. Yeah. And you can kind of pop it open and read it sideways.
Yes, but Rabbeinu Gershom says, can't do that, right? Now, back then, they didn't have even the Pony Express, right? Letters were sent by messengers. So if you paid for a messenger to deliver your message, it was probably pretty important, and thus it was very private. Right? Decree number 4. And this really affected a lot of people in European Jewry in that time. If someone becomes an apostate and then wants to return to the faith, you're not allowed to remind them of what they did. Okay? And this was a personal issue for Rabbeinu Gershom because he had a son who was forcibly converted to Christianity. And he died before he could formally return to Judaism. And this kind of forced conversion happened quite often, all too often, in medieval Europe. And so Rabbeinu Gershom said, you're never allowed to remind people of that. The circumstances were such that, it was either that or perish. So yeah, many people did perish in the Crusades rather than convert. But if you, went along with the charade and pretended to convert, and then you wanted to come back, nobody could say a word against you in the Jewish community. Okay? So Rabbeinu Gershom was one of the last rabbis to have that kind of broad authority and was able to use it ultimately for the benefit of European Jewry. Okay. Questions or comments?
Just to comment. The one thing that always amazes me is how these individual men, even when they have their following, can make such an impact on such a great many people when we didn't have printing presses and we didn't have the ability to televise all of the lectures and things. It's just still
Yes.
blows my mind.
Yes. So Rabbeinu Gershom became known because he had the only real yeshiva, the only real school of learning in all of Europe. And so people who studied with him went to be rabbis in other communities. And that's how he became known. And most of the people to whom people would direct questions about Judaism were people who had been his students, unless they came from Babylonia. Okay, next one. This is someone you may have heard of, but you may not know what he did. And that is Rashi. Rashi is an acronym for Rabbi Shlomo, the son of Yitzchak. Right? But everybody called him Rashi. And he is probably had the single greatest impact as a teacher in Jewish history. I do not exaggerate. Okay? And one of the amazing things about him is he lived most of his life in his hometown of Troyes in France, a community where no more than 100 Jews lived at any point during his lifetime. As a young man, he went to study in the yeshiva that Rabbeinu Gershom had founded in Mainz. And he returned to Troy when he was 25, and he opened his own yeshiva, where his children and grandchildren were among his best and most famous students. He made his living not from his school, but as a vintner, right? So he was really, really busy during the grape harvest. But, the rest of the time, he wrote and he taught. And he is known as the greatest commentator in Jewish history. He completed a commentary on all of Scripture and on almost the entire Talmud. He didn't live to quite finish it. The last part was done by one of his grandsons. And Rashi was known particularly for his clarity and his conciseness. On the Torah, he always gives what he believes is the simplest possible explanation, which normally would be what they call the peshat, the simple understanding of the text. Where he felt it was necessary, he would rely on the drash, the sermonic explanation given to the text, where he culls an explanation from either the midrashic or the Talmudic sources on the text. He wrote a commentary on the Talmud, which the Talmud was much more difficult for people to read than Scripture. It was a different language, different structure. Students who are starting out, even today, almost always read the text with the commentary of Rashi. There were tough times in Rashi's later years. The Crusades did not affect his community, but there were lots of refugees and challenges from other communities. Rashi did not have sons. He had 3 daughters, and all of them learned Torah from him. And that was, shall we say, uncharacteristic of Jewish teachers in that time. There's an interesting series of novels called Rashi's Daughters.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of you are familiar.
Yeah.
Sharon, you probably sold a copy or two, right? So,
Well, I have a set. I have the complete set.
you have the complete set. We used to have the complete set until Harvey, but they're fascinating books. Lots of insight into Rashi himself, lots of insight into the Jewish life of that time and place, and a lot of speculation, of course, about the daughters and their husbands, but altogether really well worth reading. Okay? So that's a little bit about Rashi, the greatest teacher in Jewish history. Okay? And continuing. Questions up to here? Yeah, Suzanne.
It seems to me that you have already said the kind of greatness we're talking about would be very difficult to have in our times. But is there, be that aside, is there anyone that you can think of who or could join this group of people from more modern times?
Well, I have my opinions about that. The problem is that hardly anybody else would agree with my opinions. You know, there's just not universal agreement among rabbis. And now I think if Rabbi Strauss and Rabbi Morgan and Rabbi Fort and I sat down together and drew up a list of people that we agreed upon over, let's say, the last 100 years, okay? The greatest Jews, the greatest hits of rabbis, or for that matter, non-rabbis, among Jewish life in the last century or century and a quarter, you know, we probably could agree upon, on a list like that ourselves. Beyond the gates of Beth Yeshurun, it becomes very dicey, right?
What about Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the chief rabbi in England?
Yeah.
Very well known.
So he would be on my list. If I were doing a top 10 rabbis of the last century or century and a half, I would put him in there. I would put the Lubavitcher Rebbe in there. I would put Rav Kook, who was the first chief rabbi of pre-state Palestine, in there. There might be another one or two Orthodox rabbis I would put in there. I would certainly put Abraham Joshua Heschel in there, and I think probably any conservative rabbi would put him in there. Beyond that, you know, I'm sure, you know, mainstream Orthodox rabbis would put Joseph Soloveitchik, who was the dean of modern Orthodoxy in the 20th century, and whose writings are still very much read today. But I'm not sure that beyond the gates of Beth Yeshurun, I could get a lot of rabbis to agree on that.
Is it hard to do this because people aren't going to agree? Because there's so many people to choose from that everybody knows?
Well, there are some people that other people would choose, but I think they're mediocrities. But
wouldn't that same opinion, wouldn't that same kind of opinion have been in the time period we're talking about? I can't believe that everybody thought everybody was on your list was wonderful.
I don't know. I think you would just have great difficulty getting broad agreement on a list. You know, the Forward used to publish this list, like the top 50 most influential rabbis in America. And they stopped doing that. You know why? Because people got mad at them. You didn't include my rabbi. You know, or what about so-and-so? You know, doesn't he count or she count for anything? You know, look at all of their accomplishments. You know, those kind of, it's much easier to get agreement on a list that ends about 3 centuries ago.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
Okay, so next one on my list is Judah Halevi. Judah Halevi lived from the year 1080 to 1142. And he lived in what was called the Golden Age of Spain, that is under Muslim rule. Wasn't golden after the Christians took it over, but under Muslim rule, the Jews really thrived there. And he was the greatest Hebrew poet of the Middle Ages, but he was also extremely learned. And he wrote one of the classic philosophical books, actually a philosophical novel called The Kuzari. What was this about? A few centuries earlier, there had been a country called Khazaria, which was between Russia and Turkey. Doesn't exist anymore. Apparently, the royal family of Khazaria adopted Judaism as their religion. It was a Jewish kingdom for a couple of centuries. Then it was conquered by Russia and it disappeared, and nobody knows what happened to the Jews of Khazaria. Ironically, most Jews never knew about it until late in its existence because it was a very isolated realm and it had limited communication with the outside world. Okay? So a century and a half later, Judah Halevi imagines the argument that convinced the king to choose Judaism. Now, Christian and Muslim representatives are invited to make their case, but both of them speak of Judaism as the highest faith next to their own. And so the king invites a rabbi also, and he eventually decides in favor of Judaism. Both the fictional rabbi and Judah Halevi are strong believers that Jews should return to Israel. And one of the most famous lines in Judah Halevi's poetry says, "My heart is in the east, but I am at the edge of the west." And in the book, the rabbi ends by telling the king that he is going back to Palestine. And Halevi, very late in his life, also went from Spain, a very long journey, very perilous journey in that time, to go back to Palestine. Unfortunately, he was killed by an Arab horseman almost as soon as he arrived in Jerusalem. And so ends the saga of Judah Halevi, one of the most influential Jewish thinkers of his time. Right? Next, we come to the one that you mentioned, Maimonides. Right? Actually, his name was Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. Maimonides is like the Arab son of Maimon. But he's known also by the initials of Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, i.e. Rambam. Okay? Heschel once said of Maimonides that if you didn't know that Maimonides was the name of a man, you'd have to assume it was the name of a university. Okay? Maimonides had what I would think of as a triple PhD. Number one, he wrote an entire code of Jewish law, his Mishnah Torah, which literally means second Torah. I'm going to talk about that next week when I talk about codes. He also wrote a commentary on the entire Mishnah. He also wrote a lengthy essay, more like a book, in which he enumerated 13 principles of Jewish faith, which was extremely influential, even if many people disagreed with some of his principles. His second area of expertise was that he wrote perhaps the greatest book of Jewish philosophy, and certainly the most influential such book, The Guide for the Perplexed. And number three, he was possibly the greatest physician of his time. It was certainly one of the greatest because he was asked to become the doctor of the court of the Sultan of Egypt. You know, the Sultan had a whole harem, you know, many children, ministers, So you're talking about tending to the health of probably hundreds of people. And it was very taxing and took up much of his time at the end of his life. There were other things, he had other projects sort of on the table that he was unable to finish because he was just so involved taking care of the sick. And, you know, he dealt with the sick of the community after he took care of the needs in the court of the Sultan, you know, at the beginning of the day. Maimonides was born in Spain. His family fled early in his life in the face of persecutions from an Islamic sect known as the Almohades. And they went to Morocco, and then he went to Israel, and finally he went to Egypt, where he settled. He had an arrangement initially with his brother David. David was a jewelry merchant, and Rambam studied and taught and led the Jewish community, and David supported the family. Well, what happened was David died at sea, and much of the family fortune went down in the ship with him. And after a long period of serious depression, Rambam decided that he better go to work because the family needed him. And he became a physician, you know, in, you know, whatever time he had. So he is really one of the most influential Jewish thinkers in history. It's said that from Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses, meaning from the original Moses to Moses Maimonides. He was so highly regarded that they wouldn't bury him in Egypt. They took his body to Tiberias. And when you go to Israel, you can still see the tomb of the Rambam to this day. Okay. Ironically, one of my ancestors is buried at the tomb of the Rambam, Rabbi Isaiah Horwitz, he died in 1630 or so. So he lived in Tiberias at the very end of his life, and that's probably why they buried him at the tomb of the Rambam. Okay. It's a big, big area. Unfortunately, the tomb of the Rambam has become one of those shrines where people buy all sorts of tchotchkes and you know, little trinkets, which is probably the last thing Rambam would ever have wanted. Questions or comments up to here? Okay, I think I have time for one more tonight, and then I'll finish this next week. The next one is Nachmanides, not to be confused with Maimonides. Nachmanides, who lived from 1194 to 1270. Moshe ben Nachman. That's why he's called Nachmanides, son of Nachman. He lived in Gerona in Spain for most of his life and was probably the greatest scholar around in his lifetime. He wrote a lengthy commentary on the Torah, much longer and much more challenging to read than Rashi's. Takes, you know, an in-depth look at a great many issues where Rashi just said, this is what the text means. You know, whereas he goes into all sorts of questions about, you know, the, you know, issues related to every aspect of it. Nachmanides was also one of the early Kabbalists, right? He wanted to hear about a Kabbalist. One of them made this list, right? He was, you know, part of this mystical movement, which began not long before he was born, but has survived and sometimes thrived up until this time. Despite his mystical inclinations, he was also a great scholar in halakha. Like Rabbeinu Gershom and Rashi and Maimonides, he also wrote quite a few responsa, meaning he would give answers to questions in Jewish law, which were submitted by other rabbis who didn't know how to answer them. Right? Now, by the mid-13th century, the Muslims had been driven out of most of Spain by the Christians. And the Christians were far less tolerant of the Jews in that time of place. The church was anxious to prove their superiority to the Jewish faith. And so they frequently arranged what were called disputations. You would call them a debate, except that a debate presumes a certain level of fairness. Because if you were talking on behalf of Judaism, you didn't dare say anything offensive about Christianity. And guess who got to decide what was offensive? The priests, right? And you couldn't lose the debates because there would then be tremendous pressure put on the Jewish community to convert. But if you won the debates, Jews, including the debaters, would get beat up, right? So you couldn't really win the disputations. Nachmanides was asked to participate in what became the most famous of these disputations in the year 1263 in Barcelona, presided over by King James of Aragon. And his opponent was an apostate Jew by the name of Pablo Cristiani. Nachmanides was able to arrange for one concession from the king, and that was the permission to speak without fear of censorship or any retribution. And so in the debate, he addressed three questions. Number one, has the Messiah come, as the Christians say it? Nachmanides said, of course, no. The world hasn't changed. Now, Isaiah chapter 2 says that in that time, nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And not only was there not universal peace in this period, but many Christians were actively involved in bloodshed. Second question, is the Messiah divine or human? So Nachmanides said, of course, there's no basis to believe that the Messiah or any human being would be divine. And the only reason Christians believe it is because they drill it into their children, or perhaps because there are, let's say, charismatic teachers. That's my term, not his. But, people who mislead others into believing it. And the third question is, who practices the true law? In other words, is Jewish law still binding? Well, so Nachmanides said, of course it is, because nothing has changed in the world. Non-Jews are not obliged to live by Jewish law, but Jews still are. And if the Messiah hasn't come, then nothing would change our situation or our obligations. Now, there was general agreement that Nachmanides won the debate, but he did not stay around very long to test the waters about that. He knew that a lot of personal resentment was directed at him, and he undertook the long journey to Palestine, where he lived the last few years of his life. And things continued to go downhill for the Jews of Spain, culminating in 1492, which we'll talk about with one of the last people on my list. Okay, next time. Any comments or questions before we conclude?
I do have a question.
Sure.
Is the book, was there a book written about him called The Test Stone, like Evan Bochad or something?
I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, I heard a story about a rabbi in a famous debate, and a book was written about it called The Test Stone. I'll have to look it up, find it for you, and I just wondered if it was the same.
Could well have been about him, because that was definitely the most famous of the disputations. There were a number of big ones. There was a big one that involved a lot of burning of the Talmud afterwards. But the most famous one was the one with Nachmanides.
Thank you for a very interesting class.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for being here. Next week, our penultimate session. Thank you all. Thank you,
Good night.
Jennifer.
Thank you, Rabbi. Enjoyed it.
Okay, bye-bye.
Good night.